So I would like to introduce the third BSP talk by Ayanna Howard, from the Georgia Institute of Technology, School of ECE, and Institute for Robotics and Intelligent Machines, quite a mouthful, entitled The Ugly Truth About Ourselves and Our Robot Creations, The Problem of Bias and Social Inequity. Thanks.
All right, so I'm going to talk about something that actually has concerned me for a little while, so maybe 2 or 3 years. So I do consider myself a roboticist. So design, develop, program, solder on the floor in the lab. And so a lot of times it's like, okay, I love technology, so why should I care what people do with my robotics once it goes out in the real world? So that's valid. But I'm actually really motivated by when I was very young, impressionable, right after I got my degree at Brown, my very first job, I had to do a coverage algorithm. So I had to basically take these little pixels, and I had a train, and I had to figure out how do you put the pixels on the train and what methodology, and so this was typical coverage. This was actually back in the 90s. And so we had these big computing machines, and we did a neural network, and it worked, and it was like awesome, it was awesome, it was awesome. And 2 years later, I found out, yeah, your optimization function was kill rate. Okay, I didn't know that. Robotics coverage, that sounded good, but it was being used for something that I didn't think I believed in. And so ever since then, I'm very much conscious of where does my technology go, and whatever opinion you have about that, making a conscious decision about that. And so a few years ago, I realized that our machines, the ones we're designing to help people and have societal impact and benefit, actually have our own human biases. They're directly in them, and there's a couple of reasons. And so really what I want to talk about are kind of the reasons why they are there, some of the instances that have come out recently that showcase this, and then provide some possibilities of how to mitigate that, which is actually really hard. So the solutions aren't absolute. I think it's an open-ended problem in a lot of cases. So the question is what is bias? So I'm going to talk about mostly implicit bias. So not overt bias where you have someone who obviously has a bias against a particular person or a particular group, but these biases that are inherent in the way that we have grown up in terms of our experiences. Sometimes, most of the times, we're not even really conscious about them until someone says, oh, you know that, X, Y, Z, like, oh, I didn't realize that that was a bias. And so, which is really difficult. So as a programmer, if I'm designing a robotic algorithm and I'm putting in my input data to do learning, I'm going to go to certain target demographics, and I may not even see the fact that, oh, guess what? I just trained on all images of women versus men. I might not be conscious of that because I'm just going to my data set and I'm just saying there's people and I'm looking at emotions and I have different expressions and that's what I'm focusing on, and yet not realizing that maybe there is something in my data set that's coming there. And so it's not just about, hey, let's avoid bias, get off at this next exit. It's not so simple. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. And some of it has to do with the fact that very, very early on, we are conditioned to just look at the world in a different way. Whatever your experience, we're conditioned that. And so that's just the part of our society. Some of the bias is designed because it's evolutionary. If I'm in a forest and I'm walking, the difference between a snake and a stick, it doesn't really matter. It's like my first inclination is, oh, it's something that's dangerous. And so that's a form of that bias that's put into you to basically save you. And so a lot of things that we have in terms of this bias and assumptions about others is really designed at the very beginning, one, based on experience, but also based on some aspects of survival. How do you take this data about the world and make decisions about it, sometimes in a very, very quick fashion, in order to do something? And so my argument isn't necessarily to change that or reduce that because it's who we are, but really think about how do we fix it when we design these robotic systems. So give a little review. Some of them, after the fact, you're like, oh, how could that happen? But these are real live examples. One of the other talks had talked about how it's always the negative examples that get the media press. And so these are the negative examples of bias that have gotten the media press. So face recognition has historically had some number of bias, if you think about it. So in fact, recently, in 2016, there was a person who was at a passport, and if you gone to the new passport centers, they have this adjustable algorithm where they try to center your face and the image, and if you're short, they kind of adjust. If you're tall, they kind of adjust. And the system was not able to take his face, and because it basically, at the end of the day, it said, you can't really see that, it says, are your eyes closed? So he adjusted and kept saying, are your eyes closed? I.e., we can't take a picture with your eyes closed because that's not a good passport picture. You're like, why is this system not able to recognize this target demographic? So there's an example, and so you think, well, that's 2016. It happened in 2010. So for cameras, and I won't mention, there were cameras that you would take it and do face recognition and it would highlight it, and it had the same error. So people didn't learn, and yet they were aware that this existed. And so things like this continue to happen. Voice recognition, there was an older study that shows that medical voice recognition system, so you think about the precursor to SIRI, was actually more accurate for men than women. And so if I'm a woman doctor and I'm basically doing my diagnosis, and what happens is these systems transcribe this information into text so that it goes into the record, the system was able to recognize men's voices more accurately than women's. So you're like, and medical field, engineering, we have some issues in terms of gender discrimination and gender labeling, but in the medical, you would think that there was a little bit more representation, and yet it was still having these mistakes. And of course, the biggest offender lately is some of the bigger companies. So again, speech recognition, this was a study that was done last year that actually showed the same thing, i.e. they had number of words in terms of recognition rate, and they showed a difference. In fact, this is their chart from their paper. They actually showed a difference in recognition rate between women. Again, you're saying a number of years, the algorithms have gotten better. The methodologies have gotten better, but yet there's still some inherent problems, and it's the same ones. So these aren't different ones, they're still the same ones. And then search engine algorithms, the one I just want to kind of highlight is some that deal with gender with respect to jobs. And so there was 2 studies in 2015. One showed that if you put in search for images with doctors, there was more images of men. If you put in nurses, there was more images of women. And so you think, well, if you look at the demographics, in terms of nurses, there are more women in terms of the nursing profession than guys. Whereas in the US, in terms of doctors, that's not necessarily the case. Overseas, yes, but in the US, not so. And so it's like, well, there's more women in nursing, so of course your results should be representative of that, but then you can't necessarily make the same argument if you're looking at doctors. And then of course the ads, which was all of our profile information, of course, is being collected. So we're fed interesting things as we're doing search and all these. And they actually did a study where they showed that if I was labeled as a woman and doing a search for job ads, I would be delivered less ads that showed high-paying executive jobs. So again, because it's my profile, there's a label. By now, I'm sure Google knows exactly even when I leave my house in the morning. And so that information is used to deliver. And so now what we're starting to see is, image recognition is like, okay, it's inconvenient. My passport isn't being taken. But now we're getting into the stage that now my livelihood is starting to be affected. How my interpretation of, again, jobs, I'm looking for a job, what gets delivered. So now it's starting to affect, the decisions are starting to affect a little bit more than being inconvenienced. And then what happens is the most startling, and this was actually really big, was there was a study that was done that showed some of the systems that are used to look at basically how often someone who was coming up for whether they should be released from jail or not, what was the probability that they would be released early in terms of parole. They showed, and again, these were 2 different studies, that actually showed that there was a bias against men specifically, but African-American men. And so now you really are talking about it's impacting someone's livelihood, someone's life, someone's family. So this is concerning. And so, but we're like, oh, this is AI. I'm a roboticist. So, AI and robotics, they're kind of together, but maybe they're a little bit separate. But the fact is that AI and robotics are so tightly coupled. They are so intertwined together that anything that goes on in what you would consider the classical AI non-embodied agent world affects directly the embodied robotics world. And so this headline, which was, again, last year, was the first time, supposedly in history, and of course the headlines were, robot kills, that was kind of the headline, but it was the instance on US soil where a robot was basically the responsible tool to kill someone. And the fact is that it was also a racial minority. And then in 2015, although they haven't done anything with this, North Dakota in 2015 actually passed a law that allows police to use armed drones. So they don't have them yet, but they can go and purchase, some drones and put guns on them and use them. And so this is now legislation. So this is allowed. And so these kind of things are concerning, especially since, there's a lot of kind of issues about, and we already know a lot of bias already in that. And so if you think about robotics and AI, how do you actually design a robot peacekeeper? And so as a roboticist, I'm like, okay, I have a lot of data. I'm in a busy shopping mall. What kind of metrics, what kind of parameters, what is my weighting function going to be? My weighting function is going to be based on what I think and what I believe, and maybe I'll take data and all of my data. I'm from Atlanta. Atlanta is actually demographically, it's fairly mixed, and so my demographic might have a different weighting function than if I was somewhere in Minnesota. And so these are kind of the biases that may actually come out in my robotic peacekeeping system that's supposed to be out there designed to, self and monitor the world and make it a better place. And so, again, these aren't answers, but these are things that are very concerning as a roboticist, because I see this happening, and I see, at some point it's going to be out of our control to figure out how to fix it while we can. And then, of course, there was a talk earlier, just right before here, about the self-driving car and the moral machine, which was this machine that, people put in their beliefs about whose life, and they say, whose life should you save? No, it's who should you kill? It's not about who should be saved, it's about who should be killed. And what does that priority mean? And in fact, if you think about it, there's more likely than not that people who are providing that information, are people like us, fairly high income, educated, pretty much, we probably will have our autonomous car, maybe. It's not necessarily reflective of the world. And so our moral machine, these autonomous cars, might reflect the opinions and the beliefs of the organization, which is probably going to be typically higher economic, educated individuals. Now, is that right or wrong? I don't know, but I think the question should be asked about that in terms of, if you think about equality and these things. And then I do healthcare robotics, and so I've actually seen this happen. Medical doctors go through this all the time. I mean, they face these ethical dilemmas quite often. And so there's kind of rules and regulations about what you should do in certain scenarios, but even then they face these questions about, disclosure and things like that. And so as an example, which is kind of, if you have a patient that comes in and they are going to die because they're HIV positive, and for a fact their spouse has no clue, what do? It's like, oh my gosh, this is like a dilemma, because my duty is to this patient, but I know that this information could save someone else's life. What do you do? And so if you think about a robotic that's out there that's actually a medical doctor and has to make a decision, there's a car accident, medical doctor comes in, I see two individuals, whose life should I save? This is a decision. Typically the robotics, in terms of the doctors, it's, who's the most critical? It's like, okay, who needs me the most? do we put that with the robotic system, or should we put it as a value proposition? I like kids probably more than older adults, whereas older adults, I'm just saying.
Valuable knowledge.
But you know, it's going to be about preference a lot of times if I'm designing it versus someone else. And so what are the solutions to this? What can we actually do? So one is, and these are good practices. So one, we can't expect roboticists to really change our attitudes. And in fact, they've looked at even implicit bias and like doing training in organizations and having everybody sing la la la, like, oh yeah, everyone has implicit bias. And it actually, unfortunately, does not work. So they show that, you know, having individuals sit in a room to learn about implicit bias, all is like, oh wow, I have implicit bias. Okay, and that's it. And so we can't expect people to change, but we can provide them tools so that whatever kind of bias they put into their systems, it doesn't have the detrimental effect that it possibly could. So one is, in the assistive technology world, you do participatory design, i.e., if I'm designing a gadget for someone else, I don't design it and say, hey, go try it out. I bring them in from the start. It's like, let's talk about this. You know, what are your needs? What are your abilities? Okay, what if I gave you this option versus this option? And maybe this aspect of bias should be part of that conversation. So when we're doing a design, we bring in other folks. We bring in ethicists and we bring in sociologists to actually talk, hey, have you thought about the fact that your hands aren't of different colors on your robotic platform? Have you thought about that? Maybe that's going to change how people interact and really have non-roboticists actually come in the room as part of your design process, because we typically invite the community already and maybe add that. It's a possibility, might work. We're kind of used to that practice as roboticists of doing this participatory design. It's just adding an extra 1 or 2 skill sets. Yeah, that might work. It takes a lot of work. Where I'm an algorithm person, so I like algorithms. So give me an algorithm solution. Can I have this bold thing that I can just put on and I can hit the button and it's my little library or add-on DLL, and so all I can say is I'm certified to be non-biased and I'm good and I'm willing to do that. And so an example would be something like a litmus test. And so litmus test, in fact, there's 2 recent researchers that did this in the machine learning world. And so, for example, if I had my application with the doctors and nurses, one is actually basically you replace it and say, you know, man is to blank, woman is to. And if there's some bias, you can kind of see, it's like, oh, my algorithm is always labeling, you know, this image, and it happens to be a guy, is always labeling it as, you know, the doctor is always a guy, the nurse is always a woman. I think there might be some bias. And so kind of have a litmus test. Have a set of tests you can do to just see, did I introduce something that I wasn't intending to? And so coming up with this type of methodology. Of course, the difficulty is trying to figure out what that set is to do the comparison, but at least it's some aspect of it. Of course, there's all of this explainable AI. You know, maybe, and we had this conversation earlier about, you know, well, this is really difficult and hard, but maybe you can have examples. And so if you think about raising kids and how I'm a storyteller. And so normally I don't just tell my kids, you know, yes or no. I always give a story. Well, when I was young, I was in a situation where and I lost my best friend for life. Okay, they understand that, losing best friend for life. And so then they start correlating. It's like, I don't really understand maybe what happened at the beginning, but I know there were some elements of that weren't good, and they start to interpret. And so having stories or having reasons or examples of, you know, good behavior and bad behavior, and maybe putting that together. So what's next? I mean, I think as a robotics, engineering, computer science community, I think bias is one of these things. It's not like generalized AI, which is, you know, sometime in the future. Bias is actually now. Even with these specialized AI systems, specialized robotic systems, it's the now. And as these systems are starting to make decisions that affect our lives and others' lives directly, that will start rearing its ugly head more and more and more often. And I think it's our role as designers to really think about this and think about it systematically, to make it so that our robots, when they're out, we don't get these headlines, you know, robot kills. It would be robot kills, but the roboticists tried really hard so that didn't happen. You know, I want to see that byline at least. And so when we as a roboticist and as a community come up, it's not always robots are going to take my job, robots are negative, robots are ... It's more of a, big companies are bad, big companies are, but as roboticists, you're just a loving community. And I think we need to change that conversation a little bit. So with that, I am at 34 seconds. I'm done.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Questions? Okay, I've got this side of the room.
So I was on a conference call the other day with some folks who were talking about Watson, and they were highlighting all the great uses of Watson, and they were talking about custom border protection. And it really got me thinking, well, in that case, you not only don't have the custom agent knowing about any potential bias in the algorithm, or the person who's the supervisor, you probably don't even have the developer in Watson being aware of the bias, because Watson's not explainable. What do you think the role of explainable machine learning and explainable AI is in trying to help identify a bias? And do you think it should be required in machine learning?
I think depending on the application, it should be required. And why I say that. So in the US, there are agencies that have oversight over certain activities. So if you think about medical, it's FDA. So if I want to do and make any claims to a medical device, the outcomes, FDA basically has to look and validate it and things like that. And so, whereas, emotion recognition and facial recognition, there's no oversight. And so for that one, it's like, yeah, maybe I'm offended. The beauty contest they had, that was AI. Okay, so maybe I'm offended, but it doesn't really change the real impact. It may make me feel bad, but not the real impact of my livelihood. And so I think, and we don't do this yet, but I think that these agencies that have oversight over certain attributes, as an example, there is the National Highway that has these rules. I don't know who they're going to have actually validate the rules and the ethical behavior. Hopefully it's like one of us that actually knows what they're doing. But that should be part of that whole kind of litmus test, having someone who's knowledgeable, that's trained in looking at bias and these ethical considerations, have their view of how to test these algorithms. That's kind of the only thing that seems palatable, i.e. organizations can understand that in certain domains because they already do that. As a roboticist, we're like, yeah, that could work as long as you have an expert that's on your team that is trained. I think that's a possible solution.
This was great. I really, really loved your survey. I thought this was amazing. So my question is with implicit bias in algorithms, and this is kind of coming from a legal perspective, it's kind of the question of paternalism. And it's not just about kind of racial bias or gender bias or whatever. It's about just really how much we want to manipulate these algorithms to be some type of version of something that is other than what the reality is of what people are actually representing or feeding into the algorithms to create them. I'm just kind of interested about your thoughts on that.
Well, so I think the problem a lot of times is that the data, and there's a whole area of sampling bias on data sets and things like that. But I think the main problem is that as programmers, as designers, we have our own bias. As individuals who are putting their data up, I mean, I look at this when I do, subject testing. I can pretty much tell you their economics, their education, their viewpoints, because those are the ones that will typically volunteer to be a subject in some of my studies. I'm not getting everybody. I know my tests are not representative US. I know that. And so my results are based on this target demographic. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we kind of have to force it a little bit, because the fact is the technology is being used by the whole world, not just the demographics that, are like me or are of a certain class. And so that's the problem. Robotics is unlike other things because it's not just like college. It's like, oh, it's only for a certain type of folk. It's for everyone. And so I think we need to be very conscious to ensure that it is for everyone.
Yeah, so this was a really thought-provoking talk. So I'm just thinking out loud here, but the idea of designing a litmus test on its own even seems problematic, because it's even if you take a step back, now it's like humans designing a litmus test for a machine or AI or a robot, where we're designing a test for things that we're sensitive to given our own history and context. But it's very possible you could be introducing other biases that we're not sensitive to, and then that could lead to a cycle of sort of negative consequences as well. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Is it reasonable to come up with a set of a litmus test that's meaningful for a system that's not it's not operating in a way that's sort of an analog to how a human sort of learns?
Yeah, so I think it's possible to come up with a litmus test that's not perfect. That's one of the reasons why we have a legal system, because even our rules are not perfect. And I'm not for one, I hate saying, we should have a governing body of, I'm actually anti that. I think it should be something that's out of the community, i.e., as an example, if I'm a state organization, like with the drone, if I'm a state organization and I'm putting out a bid for an armed drone, as part of the bid process, there should be a caveat that says, as part of our design or our procurement, we are going to have, community support, engagement, and participatory, and a litmus test. Now, the litmus test might, be like, oh, we have it, check, but at least it's a start.
This is just a little comment, but as far as I understood from some of the folks in Europe who are doing these big European robotics projects, now you're actually required to have an ethicist on the team, which is definitely not the case here, right? So, so I think possibly one of the thing that you're mentioning is that you should have some experts who are part of this process who can even point to things that one should look at or ways to do it. It's an interesting kind of policy implication of what you're saying.
I like that idea. Do you think that's even possible in the U.S.?
I think all the ethicists have fled to Europe.
I don't know. So, in SF now, if you do you almost have to have someone who does evaluations for some of the programs. Like if you don't have an evaluator, hopefully external, it's like you're not going to get funded. I wonder if there's some way of,
Any other questions? Okay, one more. Let's do it quick and then we can. Okay, you have 30 seconds.
Thank you. It's not a question, it's a comment. I think we do know, well, some of us might know the areas that we might have biases more than others. So instead of just saying we need to have robots for everyone, I think we need to ensure that in the operation of robotic technology and AI, we zoom in on the areas that are known biases and try our very best to avoid the biases.
So when people are, like, I'm very aware of my biases. But even then, every so often, I'm surprised. Like, oh, why is there that I don't have anyone? And I'm very, very conscious. And so I think that's the problem is that sometimes we just don't know to carve it out. And we think I'm the least unbiased person. I'm not going to say a racial statement ever. And yet, sometimes you do. So I think that's why you have this external something else, so that even though you're not conscious of everything, and the ones you're conscious about, definitely highlight, but there's going to be things you're just not conscious about.
Great. Thank you so much.